really transformational moment in American education. And I don't think that that's going to change post-pandemic. I think we're going to see long-lasting changes in the ways that young people learn, really disentangling education from schooling, seeing schooling as one method to being educated, and yet learning is so much broader and, again, more enriching than that experience.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of the Hope Strategy Podcast. We had a fantastic conversation today with Kerry McDonald. Josh, why don't you take it away on the bio?
Yeah, so Kerry is a friend, but she's also a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, otherwise known as FEE. And she's the author of a book called Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. And that book was super timely because it came out right before this pandemic when everybody was forced into homeschooling. She's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. She's a regular Forbes contributor. Her articles that she's written for other publications have shown up in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, City Journal, and Entrepreneur. And she lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her husband and 4 children, one of whom is my son's friend. And that's part of how we connected, although that wasn't actually the first way that we connected. We actually both authored chapters in the same book, and that was the first connection we had. And then I read her book, and I was like, this book is amazing. This is the best book I've ever read on homeschooling.
What book were you guys in together?
So it's a book called Skip College, and it's not advocating that everybody skips college, but it's saying, hey, you might want to check out other ways of getting the job done that you want to do. It's very much geared towards like entrepreneurial people.
Yeah, we talked about the timeliness of her book. It came out spring 2019. It's called Unschooled. It's all about, I think, homeschooling, but other ways to educate outside of the norm of sending your kids to, a public school. And so again, the timeliness, she said that it did really well when it came out, but it did way better this spring when parents were in, survival mode. How in the world do we do this? And everybody's searching for, how to teach my kids at home. I thought it was really fascinating because I, as a parent and with kids in school, and you as a parent with kids in school, and you've homeschooled for a really long time. You also have kids in public school. And, there's so much conversation that's happened in 2020 around education and how to do it best and how do you homeschool? And so I've had all these conversations with other parents, but I loved the opportunity we had with her to talk to a Harvard educated individual who studied this relentlessly and is a bona fide expert on all things education, specifically as it pertains to how to educate your kids at home or outside of the normal public school system. And so it was fun to ask her questions and hear not just an opinion or, well, I've done it this way kind of, but to hear she rattled off study after study after study on how this stuff should look and work and how it works best. And any parent out there that is trying to figure out the status of education in 2020, moving into 2021, this is a must listen episode. And then after listening to the episode, go and read her book and look at all her stuff because she's amazing.
Yeah, and she's not just somebody who has some ideas sharing this. She's got a master's degree in education policy from Harvard University, of all places. And she really studies this stuff. She gets into the details, she gets into the data, and she's very research driven. So this isn't just some person saying, hey, here's what I think. This is what the data says. This is what the research says. Here's what's really going on. She really gets into those details.
Yeah, she was really excited in her emails before we, as we were prepping to talk about the hope of education moving forward and how just the whole world of education has been disrupted. Our hand has been forced in so many ways. And a lot of people looked at that as a negative. Naturally, people can look at things both ways. And she's saying, no, there's a lot of hope in this. And we're going to get a lot better at educating our children in the coming years because of this. And so, yeah, that was the gist of the conversation. Like I said, anybody that has kids or that is trying to figure this out themselves, this is going to be a nugget of wisdom for them. So please listen in and enjoy the great conversation that we had with Kerry McDonald.
Something is happening in our world.
Time is very precious.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Hope in the face of difficulty.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Hope in the face of
uncertainty. I'm better now than I was. I'm experienced now.
Changing the world can happen anywhere, and anyone can do it.
The audacity of hope.
This is the Hope Strategy Podcast with Corey Blake and Josh Steinley.
Yeah, Josh was telling me about how you guys have kind of run in the same circles and have so many of the same interests and all these things, and how you just barely met in person finally a couple of weeks ago.
I know, right?
It took us like a year and a half to meet.
Crazy.
Yeah. By the way, like every time I see videos from Jack, I'm so thrilled with the progress he's making. It's funny because when Jack and James started skating together, I was like, oh, dang, like Jack's like kind of better than James. Like I kind of felt bad for James. And then like James made a lot of progress, and Brian told me, he's like, yeah, Jack's kind of like, he just alluded to once, like, yeah, like James has made so much progress and stuff, and Jack's kind of like a little bit shy about it and stuff. And then like Jack got those heel flips. Mm-hmm. And ever since he got heel flips, he's been on like this mad tear of progress where I'm just like, every time I see a new video, I'm like, wait, he's heel flipping down like those big stairs now and stuff. And like, man, he's just so like focused. Yeah, and all these kids now, it's like Cy and Jack and Anders and Chloe, like all these kids that are getting together are progressing so rapidly, and they've all like blown past me now. Now I'm like, man, I'm like so jealous of the stuff that they're doing. Like I never learned how to do half this stuff.
Is your injury better and James's?
Yeah, mostly. We went skating at Uxbridge on Saturday, and we were both doing okay. So, yeah.
Does your husband skate too? Is it the same type of bond that Josh and James have?
No.
Now, there's one other dad who skates. I think just one other dad. Rory's dad skates. But I think he's like the only skate dad out there, and I haven't met him yet either. Hopefully I meet him before he kills himself. He like cracked his head open, I guess.
I heard about that. I know. Oh my gosh.
See, that's the problem with me. We lived in Hawaii, and it was like real skate culture, skate and surf culture. And my son jumped on a board the first time and just went and was awesome. I could tell, like I get the first time I got on a board, didn't know, it did not feel right. With him, it was like he just was cruising. And I've told Josh so many times, I feel so bad because I don't do it. And so I can't teach it really. And so we've like watched YouTube videos and stuff, but I don't know. It's real. I love that Josh can go out with him and do it with
really
him.
Nice.
All of my friends that skate, their kids all skate too. And it's such a cool activity.
Yeah. Well, we should do a separate podcast about skate parents someday.
Mm-hmm.
We'll do that too.
Absolutely.
But thanks so much, Kerry, for coming on the Hope Strategy podcast and talking with us here today. We're going to record a separate intro for you before. So today it's like we're just going to start talking, but Corey and I will record an intro where we talk about who you are and what you've done previously and such. Perfect. But I guess before we really dive in, do you have any questions before we just jump into this conversation?
No, I didn't know if it is possible to finish by 1. I know we're starting a little bit later.
It'll be fine. We'll get done by 1. I mean, every time we do this, we wish we could go talking for 3 hours, but we'll get it done by 1. The focus here is just, this is a casual conversation talking about why there should be hope in the world and why we have hope for the future, because there are a lot of crazy things going on. A lot of people are happy or mad and going back and forth and looking at all the crazy stuff in the world. But we want to talk about why there's hope and what's the good stuff that's happening and what good things are going on. Give us a little bit of background on yourself. Where do you come from? What's your educational background? How did you get into homeschooling and the education industry, I guess you could say, or how did you become a thought leader within the education space?
Right. Well, it's great to be here with you today. I was an undergraduate in economics 20 years ago now, and first became interested in looking at government policy and public policy through the lens of economics, and in particular looking at education. So I started taking a lot of education classes as an undergrad with that lens of economics to look at these issues and realize that there are just so few choices, especially at that time, even more so. You know, most students in the US attend an assigned district school, government school, and have very few choices about how their children are educated, where they're educated, with whom they're educated. So that was really interesting to me. And I had an opportunity as an undergrad to shadow a homeschooling family for my senior year when I was doing an independent research project. And this was fascinating to me because at the time, homeschooling had really kind of just become something that people started to take seriously. So in 1999, I was in college in the late 90s. 1999 was the first year that the U.S. Department of Education began tracking homeschoolers. And they counted at the time 850,000 homeschoolers. So it had just become legally recognized in all 50 states a few years prior by the mid-1990s and was still kind of in its infancy, I think. But seeing this family throughout the course of the semester when I shadowed them, living and learning, tied authentically to their community and to the people, places, and things around them was just intriguing to me and was certainly in stark contrast to the education that I had received. I had gone through K-12 public schooling, and I was also doing at the time a student teaching practicum in a local public elementary school. And so I think I had never before really had an opportunity to see a different way of learning or a different way of being educated. And when I was able to witness this homeschooling family, I thought, wow, this is incredible. There are so many other ways to be educated aside from an assigned district school, aside from a conventional classroom that most of us have been through. So that really piqued my interest in education policy and in expanding education choice to families. I went to graduate school in education policy at Harvard, became increasingly interested in school choice. This was at a time where if you were interested in school choice at the kind of graduate level, the only place for you really was charter schools. They were kind of coming on the scene in full force in the early part of the 21st century. So that was where I spent a lot of my time thinking about charter schools and expanding parental choice in education through charters, which of course are generally public schools but privately operated. And spent, again, that period of time really looking at expanding freedom for families, expanding choice and opportunities. And then when I became a mom and my husband and I were looking at education choices for our children, we felt that if we sent them to school, their learning would contract, that they, had this, we live in Boston, Massachusetts. They have access to this incredible city and all of these resources through the city in terms of libraries and museums and historic sites and parks and local organizations and businesses that cater to homeschooling families. So we felt that if they went to the same building every day with the same static handful of teachers, that their learning would actually be more narrow than it could be in this kind of expansive urban homeschooling environment. So decided that we would homeschool our own children. And then, I continued my work in policy and in writing, and I wrote the book Unschooled that came out in 2019 that really, I think, captures more of this idea of self-directed education and freedom in learning.
Talk about good timing of a book. That was 2019. I mean, you unless you planned the whole pandemic because you wanted your book to perform well. I mean, what timing was that? That's amazing.
Yeah, and Corey, it's interesting because the book came out in the spring of 2019 and it did well, but then it did really well in the spring of 2020 when all of a sudden, certainly in the US, we had over 50 million U.S. school children suddenly learning at home as the school shutdowns occurred. 1.3 billion students worldwide displaced from classroom learning at the peak of the pandemic in the spring.
Now, I've heard figures that homeschooling in the United States has doubled over the past year, but where are they measuring this? Because it seems like with kids essentially being forced into homeschooling, it seems like we actually have a lot more homeschooling going on. Is that doubling figure? Is that talking about parents who have said, I'm going to homeschool and this is what I'm doing forever? This is a permanent choice? Or where are people coming up with that figure?
Does that include the at-home model where the school, the online, but through the public school? That obviously doesn't count, right? As homeschooling.
It doesn't. Yeah. I mean, this is, I think, really, in thinking about the context of the podcast and sort of some of the hopeful signs that have come out of the pandemic, I think one of those is really that parents have been put back in charge of their children's education in ways that would never have been imaginable beforehand. I mean, beginning with the spring school shutdowns, all of a sudden kids and adults were at home, isolated from their communities, and had to, suddenly adjust to this kind of disconnection and varying degrees of remote schooling and connection to their district school. But because of that, I think parents were put back in the driver's seat. In many cases, they saw what their children were learning in school through the remote learning, through Zoom schooling, and they weren't necessarily happy with what they were seeing. And in other cases, these were parents who maybe had been dissatisfied with conventional schooling in the past, but didn't really know that they had a lot of options or didn't really want to take the leap into independent homeschooling. And the pandemic provided this catalyst for them to do that. And then when they were able to exit the conventional school system, realized that it was a great gift to their children and their children's learning. I'll answer your question in just a minute, but I think it's better to give a little bit of the backstory. So, one of the first surveys that came out soon after the school shutdowns was in April. So here in the US, many of the school shutdowns began in March. And then a month into this, EdChoice did one of the first surveys of parents asking a variety of questions, one of which was about their impression of homeschooling. And I think at this point, what most people were doing was remote school at home. So, you still had those sort of under 2 million pre-pandemic independent homeschoolers, and then you had some other people who might have decided in the springtime to pull their kids from the district school for homeschooling. But for the most part, most parents were doing remote schooling tied to their district school or their private school. But still, at that time, EdChoice said, how do you think homeschooling's going? And more than half of the respondents said that they had a more favorable view of homeschooling in light of the pandemic than they had before. And those of us, of course, who had been homeschooling independently prior to the pandemic said, well, goodness, if you think this is good, just imagine homeschooling under normal circumstances when you're actually able to leave your house and be around other people and be learning in your communities with all kinds of mentors and educators and friends and all of those resources. But still, there was a signal that something was changing and that parents, I think, were getting a glimpse of different ways of learning. Subsequent surveys, USA Today, a Real Clear Opinion survey, showed similar reactions from parents in the spring, saying that they, had a more favorable view of homeschooling than they had previously. Jump ahead to summer when we started seeing parents' actions. So we had kind of their perspectives and their opinions and their thoughts in the spring. And then in the summer, we started to see what they were doing. So the first week of July in North Carolina was the first week that parents could officially unenroll their child from the district school and indicate their intent to homeschool independently, not tied to any district or any remote learning scheme. So this was the first week in July they were able to do that. So many parents registered their children to homeschool in North Carolina that first week that it crashed the state's education website. And just, huge numbers of homeschoolers there. And that was a similar trend across the country. NPR reporting in July that in Nebraska, homeschool applications were up 21% over the previous year. In Vermont, up 75% over the previous year. And these were trends we were seeing across the country. Then in August, Gallup came out with a poll finding that 10% of families or parents said that they would be homeschooling this year, which was double the number of parents saying that they would be homeschooling the previous year. Now I get to the kind of heart of your question. The way the Gallup poll worked was they specifically defined homeschooling as independent homeschooling. So you're not doing remote school at home. You're not tied to your district school curriculum. This isn't what we would consider remote schooling, the way most families were dealing with education in the spring. This was truly independent homeschooling. You have officially withdrawn your child from school or not enrolled them in school, as the case was. A lot of parents deciding not to enroll their child, for example, in kindergarten and waiting another year for that. So that was 10%, a doubling over last year. Then more recently, this is just a couple of weeks ago in November, Education Week came out with another survey findings that homeschooling, according to them, had increased to 9% of all school-age K-12 students in the U.S. That's more than doubling. So if we think about pre-pandemic, pre-March, we had about 1.8 million independent homeschoolers in the country, which was about 3.4% of the overall K-12 school-age population was homeschooled. And now if you think of that as 9% or 10% with Gallup, but let's stick with the conservative 9%, that's more than doubling to nearly 5 million homeschoolers, independent. And so I think that's just phenomenal. I think it's a real transformational moment in education. And I think even post-pandemic, when many families will be glad to return to normal and continue with their kind of conventional schooling, we will continue to see this elevated level of homeschooling and all sorts of other schooling alternatives that have emerged since the pandemic.
So one of the struggles that people adjusting to homeschooling are having is that they think it needs to look a certain way. They think homeschooling, either it needs to look like school, and so they're trying to set up school at home and do it that way, or they think they need to have a certain type of curriculum. So a lot of parents are expressing this frustration on social media saying, I'm trying to homeschool and it's killing me and teachers don't get paid nearly enough. And yet when you start looking at the details, you start saying, well, maybe the way you're trying to homeschool is making it harder than it needs to be. What hope can we provide for the parents who might be listening to this saying, you know, homeschooling sounds great, but it's so hard. What are some of the mistakes that they might be making that are making it harder than it has to be?
Right. I think this was especially true last spring. I wrote an article in the early days of the school shutdowns for Boston NPR, basically saying just that. Don't try to replicate school at home. This is a difficult situation for everybody. It continues to be very frustrating and challenging for all families, many of whom are still working and learning from home, are in many cases remote schooling, not this independent homeschooling, but remote schooling tied to their district. So it is really frustrating, I think, for a lot of families. And to the extent possible, parents not trying to replicate school at home, particularly if they have withdrawn their child or not yet enrolled their child in school, is to think of really, more of a self-directed approach to education, thinking about what your children are interested in and helping to gather resources that are connected to those interests. One of the, again, bright spots of the pandemic, I suppose, is the just vast quantity of online learning resources, many of which is free. So you see, for example, libraries and museums, which always had, some online learning resources to supplement in-person visits. But now that's really been scaled up, and almost all of that is available for free to families. You have resources like Khan Academy, which is sort of the leader in online free videos for young people. Their math programs are high quality and used in many public schools across the U.S. They have, since the pandemic began, added many other free resources, including kind of daily guides and lesson plans for families. So I think if parents really realize that they have access to a lot of different resources, and they can gather together these resources, particularly tied to their children's interests, that they won't feel so overwhelmed with this idea that they have to be replicating school at home, doing 6 or 7 hours of classroom type learning, around the kitchen table. I think even traditional homeschoolers or pre-pandemic homeschoolers, would tell you that isn't the case even under, normal circumstances, that homeschoolers, very often really try to focus more on a child-directed approach to education as opposed to kind of just moving the location of education from school to home, that it's really a much broader, more rewarding process when we can think of learning and education in a different way.
Now, the title of your book is Unschooled, and some people may have heard of unschooling, but a lot of people haven't heard of that, and it can sound kind of scary when you hear unschooling or unschooled, because people sometimes think that means uneducated. And they may have read Tara Westover's book, Educated, and they're thinking, well, if that's unschooling, I don't want anything to do with that. Can you help us understand what is meant by the term unschooled or unschooling and where that fits in on kind of the spectrum of homeschooling options?
Right. So I think it's similar to what I was just saying. It's really disentangling education from schooling, seeing schooling as one method to being educated, sort of top-down, coercive type learning where, here are your daily assignments, here are your tests and quizzes, here's your A, B, C, D, F grade. And yet learning is so much broader and again, more enriching than that experience. And so in my book, I really trace students that learn in a more self-directed way, families that have chosen a more unstructured approach to education instead of replicating school at home. I look at unschooling alumni who've learned this way, and I weave in a lot of research that shows sort of the outcomes of grown unschoolers. And I highlight various organizations, self-directed learning centers, self-directed schools like the Sudbury model of learning that have a long history of encouraging more of this kind of informal education that's not what we would consider in the top-down model of conventional schooling.
And full disclosure, my wife and I, we also homeschool. So we have one daughter who is fully homeschooling. We have another daughter who is in the public school system because she wanted to go. And we said, okay, if you want to go, we'll let you go and try that out. And so that was 6 weeks before the pandemic hit and they canceled schooling. So now she's at home doing kind of this hybrid model. And then we have our son who has homeschooled, but we send him to some specialized classes at the local public school, which is now on Zoom as well. So we've kind of got three approaches to education going on in our home. And we subscribe a lot to kind of this independent child-directed learning method of unschooling as well. But we tried radical unschooling, which is kind of like letting the kids run wild and just do whatever they want and see what they come up with. And that didn't really work with us. We found that there needed to be at least some structure there. Can you talk to us about any case studies you've seen, maybe your own family or other families? And how does this work out in practical terms on a day-to-day basis? Like, what does homeschooling look like for you as you're educating your children or helping them to educate themselves?
Right. So, unschooling, I define it in the book as sort of a broad umbrella term that has a wide spectrum from what you mentioned as kind of radical unschooling, where children have full freedom in all aspects of their life, not just learning, but also things like what they eat or what time they go to bed and all of that kind of full child agency.
Yeah, we tried that. That lasted about 2 months with us, and we were like, no, this isn't happening for us.
Yeah, I think most families are more in the middle, right? They're focused more on, we want a less coercive learning environment. We want to really focus on our children's talents and natural gifts and interests and focus resources around that. But as I say very clearly in the book, parents are the ones ultimately responsible for making sure their children are highly literate and numerate, highly educated. And I argue that that's true whether your children are homeschooled or in a conventional school, that it's up to the parents to make sure your children are getting a high quality education, that it's your responsibility as a parent to do that. So I think it's true that, most parents who choose unschooling or some of these more eclectic approaches to homeschooling really do blend, sort of formal classes or, structured activities, which with this larger vision towards providing as much freedom and flexibility as possible for their child's learning. How that works, I think, in practice, and certainly in my family, but I think in the other families that I've talked to and interviewed for the book and for articles as well, is that unschooling doesn't mean that you're not taking classes. It doesn't mean that you're not doing what we would consider school-like activities. It just means that it's a less coercive experience. It's more driven by the child's interests. And I often use the example of my older daughter, who's 14, who's been taking rigorous Korean language classes now for a couple of years. And that sprouted from her interest in martial arts, where she was is still passionate about martial arts and was doing a lot of martial arts forms and using martial arts weapons that had Korean names. And so she became curious about Korean language and culture and history and started taking Korean language classes. And we started with Duolingo, which is a free online language learning software. It's high quality and well respected. And that worked out well for a while, but she wanted something more rigorous. And so I found a native Korean language instructor, tutor for her, who she has been meeting with 3 times a week for the past couple of years and is really well on her way to being fluent. And in those classes, she uses, formal language curriculum. She takes quizzes and tests. She would do what we would think of as schooly activities. But it's all being driven by her interests and her goals to be fluent in Korean, to maybe do a semester away in South Korea in a few years, that kind of thing. She also knows that she has the freedom to quit, to stop doing that if this is no longer interesting to her. So it's, again, unlike what we would think of in conventional schooling where, okay, you have, every year, here's your foreign language assignments and 180 days of foreign language. Here she's learning all year round. It's tied to her interests and her goals. And again, she has that freedom to say, okay, I've had enough of that, if that were the case. I think another piece, and certainly the research that I've done on grown unschoolers shows that most of the grown unschoolers, certainly in one of the key surveys that was done by Professor Peter Gray, who's a Boston College psychology professor who wrote the foreword to my Unschooled book. He's done a lot of research on unschoolers and grown unschoolers. And what he found was that most of the grown unschoolers in his survey went to community college. They took community college classes during their high school years, during the high school age years, so that they were well equipped to then enter college should they choose to do that. And one of, I think, the most striking findings in his survey of grown unschoolers was that more than half of those adults were entrepreneurs, working in careers tied to interests that they had cultivated during childhood and adolescence, in large part because they had that freedom and that autonomy and that personal responsibility to pursue their passions.
Yeah, so I'm going to come at this from a little bit of a different angle because I haven't homeschooled and we've got 4 kids and we've talked a lot about it. So kind of background is, especially my wife, she studied early childhood education and she's read a lot. She's purchased a number of different curriculums and stuff and different programs. And we pre-pandemic had thought, in fact, our kindergarten, when he started kindergarten, we just decided, let's hold him back a little bit, and do some homeschool. So he was homeschooled for the first year. So I guess we technically did homeschool with some curriculum that year. There was a stigma attached to homeschooling, as you guys are well aware. It's changed a lot. I mean, I remember when I was in school, elementary school or middle school or high school, it was like, oh, that kid's homeschooled, right? There was a very specific stigma attached to this. I think, and what you were saying a little bit earlier, Kerry, is that the pandemic forced our hand at really doing away with that a lot because everybody had to do it for a little while. And so I think, empathy came to be like, oh, wow, this is something that takes effort and work, but we also see the big upside to it, the extra learning that's happening or the extra experiential learning that's happening as a result. But that transition with the pandemic, having kids in school and in our circle of friends and family who were forced to keep their kids home, but still educate them, it was a really tough transition. You talked about a little bit before, how some people do it really structured and they think they have to stick to the structure of what it would be like going to school every single day. And there's different ways to approach that. I guess looking at kind of solutions to this problem that I've seen from 2 experts, and you especially, Kerry, what tools or resources or habits or, what are some of those things that can really help through that transition? Because I think a lot of people would love to homeschool, but don't have the tools necessary or the resources to do it and to do it well and to also do it with their sanity when you've got a lot of kids at home, when you're not used to that. And again, we've been all over the map on this. And I know these are some of the questions that come up with me and my wife when we're talking, but also a lot of our friends and stuff that are like, I can see the value. I just don't know how I would make it work. And I don't have the tools or resources or knowledge to do that. So what advice would you give to that person coming out of the pandemic and maybe opting to continue to homeschool?
So I think there's a couple of things I'd respond to with your comments and questions. The first is, sort of these lingering stereotypes of homeschooling. that are really just not true, even, pre-pandemic. I think, in the early days of homeschooling, prior to it being legal in the mid-1990s, maybe there was some more truth in homeschoolers as, homeschooling, really the kind of modern homeschooling movement started in the late 1960s with, hippie liberals that were living on communes, and then kind of spread to more evangelical Christian groups who weren't satisfied with some of their public or private school options. And, sort of those stereotypes of homeschoolers as being more isolated, I think in some cases, in large part actually, were driven because of homeschooling being illegal. So in many cases, homeschoolers sort of had to be, I think, a little bit more isolated. In some cases, again, prior to the 90s, where homeschooling might have been allowed for certain families, there weren't many families doing it at the time. And in many cases, homeschoolers would get permission to homeschool from the local district, but the district would say, well, you have to be in your house all day during school hours, just like everybody else. So I think a lot of these stereotypes of homeschoolers linger. And if we really look more carefully at kind of where they originate from, we'd realize that in some cases these stereotypes were caused by the policies that prevented homeschoolers from fully flourishing in the early days of the movement. But certainly since the turn of the century, homeschooling has become much more reflective of the overall U.S. population. I mean, if we look at, for example, the number of Hispanic homeschoolers is about a quarter of the overall homeschool population, which is reflective of the overall school-age population. About a quarter of K-12 school children are Hispanic. The rate of Black homeschoolers doubled between 2008 and 2012 to about 8% of the homeschool population. We have much of the largest growth in independent homeschooling coming from urban secular families that are dissatisfied with a lot of the kind of standardized curriculum and test-driven approach to learning that they see in their schools. So modern homeschooling is very much reflective of the overall U.S. population and is not at all this kind of caricature of homeschoolers that we might imagine. And I think that's somewhat what maybe parents discovered through the pandemic, is that there is a much broader world out there. I mean, for example, even in the spring, when families were doing some of this remote schooling, they weren't really technically independent homeschooling. A lot of grassroots homeschool organizations, Facebook groups, other informal networks of homeschoolers really opened their arms to these newcomers who were curious about homeschooling. And I think a lot of that kind of welcoming sense, that willingness to reach out to families that were really struggling with this shift and all of this disruption to their lives and their learning, I think that might have gone a long way to making these new homeschoolers realize, wow, homeschooling isn't what I thought it was, and there's much more possible here. And then when they start realizing all of the resources available to them, again, many of which is free or very low cost, they realize that it's not all up to them as the individual parent to be sitting around teaching their child, that really homeschooling involves facilitating your child's learning by connecting them to various resources, online learning resources, tutors and mentors and educators, classes and activities. And of course, we've had that somewhat dulled because of the pandemic, because so many organizations and businesses are closed still. But even then, there are so many of these other resources. So I think more families are seeing that. I'd also say, one of the really encouraging trends that we've seen throughout the pandemic in terms of education was the trend of the pandemic pods that began to emerge over the summer. And what this involved was families realizing that they didn't want their children learning in isolation the way they did in the spring. They wanted their kids with other kids learning safely, but socially. And so they would get together with other families to either be independent homeschoolers, kind of a modern version of homeschool co-ops where parents might take turns facilitating a curriculum or guiding a child's learning throughout the week, taking turns in different families' homes. Or in many cases, it was parents who kids were still enrolled in public school, but were going to be doing remote learning. And they didn't want their kids doing that again in isolation. So they gathered with other families to have the remote schooling occur in one particular home with a group of students, or again, rotating homes. And in some cases, again, with these independent homeschoolers, families would pool their resources to hire a teacher or a tutor or a college student to oversee their child's learning and kind of be with them during the day. So there have been many opportunities that have sprouted from that. I've written about how in some cases, teachers realized that they could make more money with more flexibility leading these pods than they could as a classroom teacher. And it was much more fulfilling for them. So we're seeing more opportunities there. We're seeing a lot of education entrepreneurship sprouting throughout the pandemic. That's really encouraging a whole assortment of education opportunities. For example, there's a new online learning startup called Expanse that providing online, high quality, high touch remote learning for families, but is accessible to them. So it's much lower cost than a lot of other private options. And I think we're going to continue to see those types of entrepreneurship models emerge that have all kinds of different price points and that make schooling alternatives, again, more accessible to more families.
Yeah, we saw that in Hawaii, where there was, one or two schools on the entire North Shore of Oahu, but then there was a couple of families that said, if we just pulled a little bit of money together, we could pay teachers more than what they're making at the school and also get them a very one-on-one, with 12 students or 10 students, so much more interaction with the teacher. It made a big difference. But one of the things that I noticed in starting to do more homeschooling with the kids is that naturally, because we were using the technology available, all of these different websites you're talking about, YouTube, and some other stuff that I think some we paid for and some was free, screen time went up significantly. And when you've got a kindergartner and a second, third grader, it's something that we're cautious of as parents, is because we've read the studies and stuff on how much time kids should spend on screens. And even though it's time on a screen for learning, they're still young and they're trying to build a healthy relationship with technology and with an iPad or a computer or whatever. Do you have any thoughts, or is there any science or study or, anything on that specific subject on how, or maybe how to balance that in a way that's healthy for a kid to not just sit on an iPad all day, doing schooling?
I think it's hard for all of us, right? We're all relying so much more this year on technology. Thankfully, I think the pandemic would be, so much worse if we didn't have this digital connection. So part of, I guess my first response would be for parents to take a little bit of the pressure off themselves. That increased screen time is inevitable at the moment, as long as the shutdowns and the pandemic related orders continue. So, don't feel so bad and don't be so hard on yourself. Give yourself a little bit of grace, I think, would be my first response. The other piece of that is that because it's certainly where we are, here in Boston, and I think other places around the country, so much is still closed or unavailable to us. So when you think about, typical learnings, particularly homeschooling under, normal circumstances, you'd be spending more of your time outside of your home than inside. You'd be going to these museums and you'd be taking classes and gathering together in groups to do learning or to engage with each other. And that's just not happening. And so I think, again, we just have to acknowledge that it's inevitable that both young people and adults will be on screens, maybe more than any of us would like, but it's sort of the present reality. That said, I would again suggest as much as possible for families to make these connections, to make sure that your children are having social interaction. Again, even if it's just outside for a walk with other friends, those are the kinds of things that we can be doing. And, making sure that you're, trying to find ways to connect with others in real life to the extent possible, looking into these pandemic pods if that feels better to you or more feasible to you. But again, acknowledging that all of us are relying a lot on screens.
Yeah.
And going back to your question, Corey, about resources for people who are just starting to investigate this, there are a lot of books about homeschooling out there. I'll give a shameless plug for my wife's book. It's called Why I Love Homeschooling. She wrote that in response to the pandemic and these people who are struggling with homeschooling and saying they hate it and everything. But Kerry's book, and I'll say this in a way, Kerry, would never feel comfortable saying it about her own book, but I've read a lot of books on education and homeschooling, and in my opinion, Unschooled is the book that you would get if the question is, I don't know anything about homeschooling and I want to educate myself on what homeschooling is and what all the options are out there and how does it work. It's the best book that I've read that gives you an overview of everything to do about homeschooling from one end of the spectrum to the other and all the resources that are out there. So I can't recommend Kerry's book highly enough for those who are saying, gee, I'm interested in homeschooling, but I don't know where to start. Start with Kerry's book.
Oh, thanks, Josh. I appreciate that.
It's always interesting when we talk to experts on any subject matter, because we're trying to unlock all that is in your brain in a 50-minute or in an hour period. I mean, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you would say is highly relevant, very important as we look at the transition that we're making in education, during the pandemic and then eventually post-pandemic, and where you see the greatest opportunities and where you see the most hope, and anything that we haven't touched on yet?
Yes, I would say two things. I think we've touched on it to some degree, but I'll just reinforce it. Again, we're in this really transformational moment in American education, and I don't think that that's going to change post-pandemic. I think we're going to see long-lasting changes in the ways that young people learn, in the demand for school choice mechanisms, for example, from parents. We see, according to Real Clear Opinion Research polling, that parents' support of school choice policies like education savings accounts, tax credits, scholarship programs, vouchers, and so on is at record high levels. It's up even 10% more than it was when they polled in April, to about 77% of parents saying they support expanded school choice, because parents are realizing that there are other ways to learn, that there might be better ways to learn, and they're really wanting access to some of that funding that's going to schools, particularly when those schools are closed to in-person learning. And parents are saying, well, this is nonsense. You're still getting your full suite of tax dollars to fund empty schools during the pandemic. How about some of that comes back to the student rather than the system? So I think we'll still continue to see, a lot of demand for school choice among parents. This parent empowerment, I think, will continue to increase. Parents realize that they are capable of facilitating their child's education in ways they didn't realize they could before, particularly with these online resources and other options available to them. One of the things I talk about in a lot of my articles is what happened in the wake of Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 that really devastated the city of New Orleans and disrupted the entire education system there. And Terry Moe, who is a professor at Stanford University, wrote a book called The Politics of Institutional Reform, where he looks at what happened in the wake of this external disaster, this kind of natural disaster. And I think there's a lot of parallels to what we see here with COVID-19, that in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, all of those established systems of control and bureaucracy and sort of institutional mandates, all of that went away. So that now New Orleans is one of the few districts in the entire country that's almost entirely all charter schools. And Terry Moe argues that really couldn't have happened had it not been for this vast disruption that occurred in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And I think we're going to see similar changes, particularly again as parents see that there are other ways to learn, are dissatisfied with many of their school reopening plans, don't like that their tax funding is tied up in unopened schools. I think we're going to see that kind of be long lasting for families looking for some differences and some policy changes there. And then I think I'd also just end by saying that I'm really hopeful, again, for education entrepreneurship and the possibilities there for transforming education and making these different types of learning innovations available to more families. The Wall Street Journal reporting, for example, that entrepreneurship is at record levels, that more people have been starting businesses during the pandemic than have been creating new businesses over the past decade. So we're seeing just tremendous growth in all aspects of the economy in terms of entrepreneurship. Of course, that's not offsetting the vast number of businesses that have been shut down due to government orders. but it is a hopeful sign that entrepreneurship is alive and well. And I think, again, education entrepreneurship is ripe for more opportunities and more innovators to create some really wonderful options for families.
Awesome. I couldn't agree more. We run a digital marketing agency, and we've seen in the past year, a lot more startups that have come to us that their hand was forced again. A lot of hands are being forced this year, right? To say this thing wasn't working out, or the job that I had didn't work out, or I've had this idea for a long time and now I see an opportunity to do it. And we also very specifically have seen a lot of those in the education space. So I too am hopeful for what the future holds as, an entrepreneur myself and somebody who's taught entrepreneurship to students. This is, I'm excited, and as I know you are, especially as an expert who's dedicated so much time and energy, resources to this over a long time, to see what the next, year, 2, 5, 10 look like. It's going to be awesome. So we really appreciate the time. And where would you say at this point is the best place? So you've got the book that we've mentioned multiple times, Unschooled, but then I know that you're a contributor at Forbes and a bunch of other publications. I mean, where would you say is the best place for people to learn more about you and the work that you're doing and to get involved?
Yeah, I'm a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org. So the best place for people to find me is at my website at fee.org/Kerry. There you'll find a link to my book, a link to all of my articles, and you can see my social media links and go ahead and send me an email.
Cool. Well, Kerry, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us today. We appreciate it, and we look forward to being in touch.
Thanks again for having me.
Yeah,
thank you, Kerry.
Hello, it's Corey here, and I just want to thank you so much for listening into the Hope Strategy podcast. I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are enjoying having these amazing conversations with these incredible individuals talking about hope. We'd love it if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, and leaving us a review on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and share it with anybody you feel that can benefit from these messages of hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy podcast.